Hello and welcome back to In Search of Black Power. I'm your host Lawrence Grandpre, and today we wanted to cover a topic that frankly is one of the most interesting things that I've seen on YouTube over the past few months. So at the time of recording, you go on YouTube and people are talking about this particular African leader as if he's the second coming of this revolutionary. And it's so interesting because they're doing all the YouTube things, like and subscribing. They're using YouTube travel video gimmicks, but they're going to, of all nations, Burkina Faso, this small nation in central West Africa, known for its military coups, to cover this military leader. And he's getting millions of views talking about going into Burkina Faso, seeing the people, seeing the changes, promoting this particular leader. And of course, that's Ibrahim Traoré. And I say in the interview, this is with myself and my co-worker Dayvon Love, I was at a July 4th cookout. And one of the guys, my brother's friends, I didn't really know, had a Thomas Sankara, Ibrahim Traoré, like the second coming of Sankara shirt on. It's like something has happened with the alliance of Sahel states. Something has happened, particularly with Ibrahim Traoré, that has broken through even just into, I guess you could almost say, popular culture, but something about him as a symbol of revolutionary resistance to the West. This idea that the people have tried democracy, but as Traore said, no nation has ever developed under democracy. That he's willing to turn to the Russians and the Chinese, kick out French troops, and nationalize resources, has resonated given that he's so young. But one of the things we want to talk about in this podcast is Burkina Faso. Traore is not the current leader of the Alliance of Sahel States. That's actually the leader of, I believe, Niger. And the alliance is Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And in many ways, some of the more valuable resources are not in Burkina Faso. They're actually in Mali and Niger. So it was important to do this conversation because what is happening there, the rejection of the mythology of Western democracy as central to development, the possibility of a Pan-African connection between these two states, these three states, resisting Western hegemony, but also looking beyond Ibrahim Traoré, beyond one particular revolutionary leader who could be killed, and then where does that lead to revolution, but to see structurally what it can teach us here in the West, what lessons we can glean, and what can we actually learn about what's happening over there, and anything possible for us to potentially feed a genuinely anti-imperialist Pan-African movement that may be happening in our time, but we need to actually know enough about the material things happening on the ground to make that determination. So once again, we thank you here at LBS Baltimore for all your support. Check us out on lbsbaltimore.com. Check out all the other conversations about the Alliance of Sahel States and Pan-Africanism on blackliberationmedia.com, YouTube, and the website. And with that, we will see you on the other side.
Peace, family. This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. I'm here, my brother, colleague, Lawrence Grandpre.
How you doing?
And so, it's good to always be able to chop it up. Again, another installment of In Search of Black Power. We're going to talk about the Sahel and talk about its relationship to the larger, global political radical movements today. And one of the things that I want to do actually, just to put some context on this conversation, Lawrence, because one of the things that you and I have talked about for many years is, the connection between the local political work that we do from the revolutionary Pan-African nationalist perspective that we've talked about, in a variety of different contexts. But also talk about like how that links and relates to national and international struggles for liberation and freedom. And I know for me, in the conversations you and I have had, there are lessons that are important to be learned in looking at examples of international resistance to imperialism and colonialism, white supremacy, that are applicable here and vice versa. So I'm actually particularly interested and excited to have this conversation because this is an example in some ways of concrete applications of this perspective beyond the local and statewide work that we do in Baltimore and the state of Maryland, looking at it internationally and thinking about what lessons can be learned in both directions. So for me, that's one of the things that, in terms of wanting to get at, to have this conversation. So to start with, I'm sure there may be people who don't know much about it. What is the Sahel, and what is this movement that is happening in the part of West Africa called the Sahel? What is it?
So it's Northwest Africa. So if you start at Algeria, Mediterranean coast, you have the Sahara Desert, which goes down into the middle chunk of that first fat part of Africa. And that's become more desert-like over time. Before you get to Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Togo, the actual tropical coastline, that's an intermediary zone. That's grassland. That's more arable, more able to support dense populations. And that's the Sahel. Right, so we're talking about Mali, and we're talking about Burkino Faso. We're talking about between the top of the Mediterranean and the bottom near Ghana. That intermediary part is the Sahel. So you have ancient kingdoms like the Kingdom of Mali and Mansa Musa and Songhai, Kingdom of Ouagadougou, and that's an ethnic group that still has legacies to the current ethnic groups in Mali and throughout the region. So this is an area of incredible gold wealth, as seen through Mansa Musa. And not surprisingly, it became under imperialism, particularly French imperialism. So, different countries had different flavors of it. But even to this day, France has an incredible neo-colonial impact on the region. People talk about France having no gold, but having some of the largest gold reserves in the world is because they're holding the gold of many of these countries. Similarly, talk about these countries not printing their own currency, being printed in France. And there's this economic bloc of nations in West Africa called the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, which kind of serves as a regional economic hegemony organization that many of these states used to be in. So when you have what happened in Libya, of course, in the 2010s, Libya was run by Muammar Gaddafi. He agreed to give up his weapons of mass destruction program. That did not stop the West from going in and violently taking him out, sort of using, many people argue, Islamic extremists as a sort of force multiplier for the Western forces. Gaddafi being, an eclectic figure, but in many ways Pan-Africanist, or especially sovereignty, using Libya's oil wealth to have some of the highest rates of economic and human development in that part of the world. West viewed that as a problem, took him out violently. He was killed. But with the using of Islamic extremists to go after Gaddafi, many people know Libya has descended into consistent civil wars and chaos. So many of the Islamic extremists that they juiced up during that time began to spread out into that region, into the Sahel. And particularly into these border regions. So you have Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, three of the countries we want to talk about today. They all share borders. And while we as the West look at a map and sort of see, well, that's the country, in reality, those borders are very porous. There is no fence. There is no economic, and there's no political. In many places, the state essentially lost power to these Islamic extremists, and they took over. So you have the Sahel version of Al-Qaeda and the Sahel version of Islamic State, which we'll talk about a little bit later, similar but distinct, basically setting up shop in these areas, and people didn't like that. So if you are people in this region, you might be Muslim, but the version of Islam they're practicing, the things they're doing with statecraft, don't reflect what you want to see as a people, and therefore there is a demand for military actions to solve it, but France isn't doing it. So again, these people had French bases in the region, assuming France and the West would use their might to stop this. But many people said they weren't, and when you think about it, many people argued it's in their interest for these nations to be destabilized. So it's not really their number one interest. It's not dealing with Islamic radicalism. It's continuing to exploit people economically and using those forces to protect the neo-colonial economic infrastructure in that region. So with that compilation of grievances, there were increased calls for security that led to military coups in the region. And the military coups all throughout Africa right now. But we'll focus specifically on these three. Mali in 2021, Burkina Faso in 22, Niger in 23. And when the coup happens, they get kicked out of ECOWAS. So part of the cooperation with things were like infrastructure, like dams and necessary infrastructure was cut off from ECOWAS and the Western Bloc. So basically, they were like, hey, if you're going to kick us out, we'll click up together. We kind of have to click up together for the security concerns. And so they created this association of Sahel states. And in France, that's the acronym is AES, right? So the AES was formed in 2023, formalized in 2024. And basically has been doing cooperative Pan-African statecraft in the Sahel, particularly around security, but increasingly around cultural unity, like sharing a flag and all these different things that begin to rejuvenate people's interest in sort of Pan-Africanism in the region, particularly because they were seen as delivering on security. And with that, you have the youngest of these folks being in Burkina Faso, his name being Ibrahim Traoré. And in April 25, there was reports of a failed coup attempt against taking him out in Burkina Faso. And for whatever the reason, this went extremely viral. Like there were Instagram videos, YouTube videos with millions of views. Like influencers go into Burkina Faso, showing the improvements he's making, showing the support he has. And Traore has basically become this symbol of anti-imperial new generation of African leadership rising up in the legacy of many of our listeners know Thomas Sankara.
So before you go deeper into that, so I want you to continue on that. I want to put a pin in that for a second. And I want to ask you to tease out a little more. So you have kind of the general geopolitical clash between the kind of many of which, like you mentioned, like Islamic-based, social political formations that in many respects expanded as a result of what the United States and the West did to Gaddafi in Libya. And what I'm actually to parse out, because there is an anti-Western impulse there, it doesn't necessarily align with Black liberation or even radical anti-imperialism even. And there are ways that I think, and a more colloquial way of putting it is all the radical shit will look the same.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can tease out a little bit the distinction, and you did a little bit in terms of Gaddafi, because I think Gaddafi we wouldn't put him in a category as like a revolutionary saint, for instance. But there are things that Gaddafi committed to as it related to Africa that might have made him more distinct from other of the kind of Islamic-based, political formations. So if you could tease that out a little bit, because I think that'll help then further solidify what makes the Sahel as distinct, as opposed to what the West wants us to do, which is to just lump all that shit together. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. So many of the countries in this region, the predominant religion of the people is Islam. But not all forms of Islam are the same. In the West, we get sold sometimes a version of, especially Islam in the state, as being conservative, like Saudi. And like women can't drive, have to cover up their heads. That's not the form of Islam that's practiced in like Burkina Faso. Like just watching some of the videos, apparently it's a rite of passage for like everybody, male and female, to learn to ride a motorcycle. So just a very different version of Islam than what people are used to. So when you have these radical Islamic groups, they're not coming to work within the state, to work democratically. They're coming to use force to basically pursue their agenda. And that agenda may be nominally anti-Western in some ways, but it's largely around their vision of how Islam should be practiced within the context of a state. And many of these folks, some of them get recruited from these countries, but there's not the majority opinion of how Islam and the state should mix in these countries. So again, you have ISIS, and some people say, well, ISIS was distinct from Al-Qaeda. And from what I can see, a general distinction is ISIS believes in, they want an Islamic state that they rule under Sharia law. So it's less about necessarily anti-imperialism. It's anti-imperialism to the extent that they can have their caliphate and have extreme, strict Sharia law. So when they come in, they like take away people's cigarettes. They do gender segregation. And again, this is not the Islamic or even gender relationships that are dominant in this part of the world, per se, even though they are Muslim. So they're seen as losing support in some ways because they're so strict around their interpretation of Sharia law and governance. Now, Al-Qaeda, 9/11, does have more of a global anti-imperialist sheen to it in some ways. But from my research, what it seems like they're doing is they're definitely trying to undermine the state, to basically get support from people away from the indigenous state and towards them. In some ways, people don't necessarily love the state that they're serving under, but they don't want, what Al-Qaeda is doing is like sabotaging the state to make people come to them. So they're not improving the water, they're sabotaging the water systems, hoping people get mad at the state and come to them, and then they provide the water. Right? They're sabotaging the education system so people come to them when they can provide education. So it's one of the things that they're claiming to like trying to have this more global anti-Western, we provide for the people. framework. But the way they're doing it is to build a political base, not by providing, but by attacking the indigenous infrastructures. And people are like, yeah, the indigenous infrastructures aren't good. We want to improve them. Mm-hmm. We don't want you to come in and attack them. So we are dependent upon you. We want to be able to control these institutions ourselves, right? So they look to the military as an alternative to Al-Qaeda and ISIS as something that was more controllable and accountable to them.
And that's a good segue. So then talk about then how that then helps a figure like Traore, come to prominence and the power and image that has proceeded as a result of the coup that has emerged.
Yeah, so to understand why Traore has become so popular, I think it's important to talk just a little bit about Burkina Faso and Thomas Sankara. Burkina Faso has had apparently the most military coups of any country on the planet. And even the name Burkina Faso was an African name brought to it by a leader who took power in the 80s, 83, Thomas Sankara, who was a revolutionary, Pan-African socialist. He was Upper Volta, like the Volta River, but he called it Burkina Faso, the land of upright people, as sort of a Pan-African sort of claiming of the land for the people. And in that, he did things like rejected foreign aid. He planted 10 million trees, they say, to prevent the Sahel from turning into the Sahara, basically anti-desertification type stuff. He was open about confronting AIDS in a very progressive way in the 80s when most even American folks weren't talking about AIDS, birth control, and dealing with forced marriage and polygamy. So very progressive on gender, economic relations, and all these things. And he was killed in 87. So then you have Traore being born just around the time when Sankara dies. And when he rises to power against a leader who was nominally elected with a very low turnout election, as a military figure who not only takes on the visual appearance of Sankara, but talks about wanting to deal with Western imperialism in a way that feels similar to Sankara. So this idea of especially generational change of these, and many of the other leaders in the Sahel are older. In this Sahel alliance, the Sahel states are older. So as a young, charismatic, anti-Western figure,
he's like 36, 37.
Yeah, late 30s, like 37, I think, right? So he's become a figure that has really been, some Westerners say algorithmically boosted by foreign figures, but it's become a viral figure and someone who's even become like part of like AI deepfakes of him in ways that sort of like put him in this revolutionary Pan-African romantic frame, which isn't necessarily where he is. Like he's pragmatically working with Russia, the so-called Wagner Group, China, trying to cut these deals to increase development. So in some ways, he's about development in a way that maybe isn't exactly what Traore was on in terms of revolutionary international socialism.
Right. Sankara,
yeah. So in terms of even beginning to disentangle what people are projecting on the Traore and what's really there, if not to denigrate the good he's done, to say that there is this revolutionary romanticism around him as a figure, especially when the West he claims the West keeps trying to kill him. So just him resisting the assassination attempts, people project onto that a sense of hope, understandably. But I think it's important to also go deeper into thinking about what he's doing and what other people in Sahel are doing pragmatically beyond him as a revolutionary individual.
So talk about some of those things, some of those specific things outside of Traore, the kind of pronouncements, the kind of rhetorical pushing back against Western intervention and demonization. What are some of the other things that is happening in the Sahel?
Yeah, so in Burkina Faso, for example, they're very adamant about one thing that's going viral is they're trying to improve the roads, and everybody is pitching in. So they have pictures of like white and Asian folks being basically forced, quote unquote, to come in and help everybody else fill in potholes. So that idea of like, you don't get to come in and just explore this, you have to serve the larger communal vision of national uplift, has been an example of one thing people have felt that the roads are getting better. They also have emphasis on indigenous food production. So you look at influencer videos, the influencers go to like a tomato sauce canning operation where you literally see them putting the tomatoes in the cans, claiming to deal with Western imperialism. With that, I think him as a revolutionary figure in Burkina Faso obscures the fact that Niger and Mali also have these massive mining operations. So in terms of like pure resources, Burkina Faso has gold too, but Mali has actively like arrested Australian miners to basically nationalize their mines and demand better terms of negotiation with the Western mining companies and Chinese mining companies, bringing in Russia and China to basically compete with these Western entities that want to exploit their resources. And Niger, for example, has uranium. So we see what happens with Iran with this idea of nuclear weapons being a threat to Western hegemony. Western entities have controlled those mining for uranium rights for a long time, and they're actually working to renegotiate that and basically control more of those resources. Similarly, the Niger River is a massive water resource for the entire region. So, like I said, ECOWAS threatened to cut off cooperation on the dam they were building, and now they're trying to figure out ways to do cooperative water sharing with things like that. So I think that's part of the reason why it's important to go beyond Traore and his individual cult of personality to see the larger institution building and geopolitical positioning happening within the Sahel states towards a regional sovereignty that would be obscured if you just focus on Burkina Faso and Traore.
So let's talk about, and you've already addressed some of this. So the notion of like democracy promotion, because I think there's a way that in mainstream media, when people are discussing, foreign policy, international affairs, and U.S. intervention, it is often under the guise of the notion of democracy promotion. And there's propaganda that's associated with it. And I imagine, a lot of the rhetoric from the West about the Sahel is it being a danger to democracy. And which is, often, hilariously hypocritical of the West, given many of the anti-democratic regimes that it supports, if they perceive it that it's in their interest. Talk more about democracy promotion in general as a concept, like as in terms of the frame that is used in discussing political formations that the West doesn't like, and how is that being applied specifically? So in terms of the discussions that are happening by the West, how is that being applied to the Sahel?
So that's one of the reasons why people in the West are told, well, you can't support Traore or what's happening at AES because these are military coups, right? Of course, when you actually look at the history of the region, the nations they're claiming they're trying to take control over are boundaries and borders produced by colonialism in of itself. So these were not entities designed to function within a traditional Western democratic system, given the ethnic, tribal alliances going across national borders make it very difficult for these states to operate, and that in many ways was intentional. This was an attempt to produce racial ethnic strife to prevent them from consolidating in ways that would deal with the West. So obviously, like you said, the West is barely a democracy. America is barely a democracy. We deal with Saudi Arabia, get that oil all the time. And one of the things that is interesting is that even young, educated folks who in the past might be more susceptible to pro-Western propaganda are like, we're tired of democracy promotion. Because one of the things that I think made it click for me is that when you talk about democracy and freedom and rights, a lot of what the West actually wants in these developing companies is property rights. So when they bring democracy, they're bringing court systems that mirror the Western court systems, that give incredible legal power to people who have the legal right to own land and the legal right to own resources, and they want those protected through strong legal mechanisms. So they'll sell you individual human rights for things like freedom of religion, gay rights, and things like that. But these independent judiciaries also adjudicate who has the rights to own the resources. And of course, state control over those resources violates their individual right to property. So you see a lot of folks talking about democracy really is economic democracy. And what we, the West, call democracy is the opposite of economic democracy. Economic democracy would require a degree of socialization of control of resources that would violate individual property rights that our legal democratic institutions, quote unquote, were designed from jump to protect. The right for individual corporations from other nations to legally exploit these entities. And so it's just a powerful, once you understand it, you understand why it's, in people's minds, it's not contradictory to say Traore is protecting democracy when no one voted for him. Because his mechanisms of economic distribution from an entity like the military, which again is very easy from a Western perspective, where for the most part we don't have an entity like ISIS or Al-Qaeda threatening our geographic territory and control of parts of America. there is a question of Traore versus entities like that. Which of those is actually more accountable to community? Mm-hmm. So in a theoretical world, maybe you would want Traore to run. Mm-hmm. But the reality of the situation on the ground, especially given the West's ability to buy elections and to, like literally Ivory Coast is an American-supported pro-American state that is threatening the sovereignty of Burkina Faso. Mm. So that's how it typically works, where if you open it up democratically, then you have the ability for either Islamic forces to win and then have more legitimacy when they co-opt institutions and co-opt the state, or pro-Western subterfuge to basically take over the electoral process. Mm-hmm. Right? So again, once you remember the elections that did happen in these entities, Burkina Faso, for example, extremely low turnout, parliamentary systems, meaning that if your party just gets a majority, it's not a majority of the people, it's the majority, you get the most votes as a party. Mm-hmm. So if you have 20% turnout and you get 30% of that 20%, democratically, you are now legitimate in the West's eyes. So is that really legitimacy? Mm-hmm. Do you really have a mandate for the people to speak in that way? But all of these things get obstructed with just this basic notion of a binary yes-no democracy. Mm-hmm. Increasingly, I think it's obvious to Americans, we don't easily fit within that binary anymore. We have the Electoral College. We have people not weighing the popular vote, weighing the presidency. But especially when it comes to justifying imperial extraction of resources through institutions like courts that are designed to protect rights, seeing it first and foremost as property rights they're set up to protect. And human rights, quote unquote, is only the sugar they use to wash down the violence of that extraction. And that's not just Africa, that's also nations like Latin America and other parts of the world as well.
Mm-hmm. So I mentioned at the top, our perspective on Pan-Africanism and how the work that we do locally is informed, both by history, but also informed by, knowledge, paying attention to international struggles against imperialism and white supremacy and capitalism and the like. And, one of the things that we have expressed on this platform has been in some ways the impotence of radicals and the left to have the ability to actually influence the global political landscape. And I think that the emergence of the Sahel states provides an opportunity to observe, what it looks like for folks to be resisting capitalism, imperialism, white supremacy on the continent in a way that in some ways mirrors some of the stuff that we're engaged in here. So kind of two questions in one. The first is, if you can draw a connection, like what are the things that people who are doing work, revolutionary political work here, what are some of the things that we should be paying attention to and observing of the Sahel states, both in their resistance to imperialism and their work to try to build their, political project? And what are some concrete ways for those that are interested in supporting that work? What would you recommend for radicals here in the West? Things that we could do, policies we could support, activities we can engage in that will be helpful to the work of the Sahel states.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that comes to mind is when we talk about Afro-pessimism, it's become sort of this philosophical concept around the permanence of racism. But why Wilderson and Hartman chose that term is because the term existed before that as their theory. It was the way people talked about African states. And also a way people think about African institutions, was that they're pessimistic that they can ever actually be democratic, and pessimistic they can never actually serve the people's needs. So this was like a term they used in 60s, 70s, 80s discourse around Africa. Just like, we're pessimistic that Africa can ever not be a basket case. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes the left, unfortunately, reflects its own version of Afro-pessimism around the ability for Black folks to produce institutions that meet our own needs. Mm-hmm. Right? So I think one thing that Sahel does is challenges leftists to first see beyond the revolutionary individuals, because I think the sheen around Traore, I was actually at a 4th of July cookout and someone had a Sankara Traore shirt on, right? So he's just kind of become this transcendent cultural figure. I think it's going to be easier for people to say, well, the institutions sold him out, the institutions became corrupt, as opposed to actually seeing, like, what is the history of institution building in that region, period. Like, one thing I was shocked to see is that there was this massive UN-sponsored, Western NGO-sponsored water project that was brought into the region that a lot of other nations signed on to. But they completely ignored the fact that Libya already had this massive water infrastructure that was bombed during the invasion. So just being able to look at things like, well, what is the actual water infrastructure in the region? And like, how are they actually building and expanding? How are they doing things like, what type of energy are they using? Is it nuclear power? Because even folks like Cheikh Anta Diop talked about the possibility of nuclear energy being a tool to power the needs of Africa. But nuclear energy is very hierarchical. It is very state-controlled. It is top-down. Maybe solar power would make more sense. But and that's actually a good debate to have both here domestically and overseas, because we need energy too. We need water too, right? So just actually linking the needs of people in America, whether it's Flint or Baltimore, around water, like what are the technologies and systems that we can learn from what they doing in Africa around conserving water, building water infrastructure in sustainable ways. Like one thing I've talked about a couple of times is if you're in the West, it is hard to know what levers you can pull to improve conditions internationally. But I think an example of that might be like around something like solar energy. That region gets a lot of sunshine. But the intellectual property rights, the Western economic violence through things like patent controls, means that it's hard for them to produce their own solar panels without America suing them. So similarly, like you're in America, we can change our laws around intellectual property to make it so that we can actually have an equitable technological exchange with the developing world, so they can actually develop a solar energy infrastructure that meets people's needs indigenously. So that could be something that you could actually work on with your Congress people. You could learn more about solar energy, building solar panels in your own community, like solar roofs in the houses that we need. These houses are decaying in Baltimore. They need things like solar panels and solar roofs. So there are all these legitimate, pragmatic connections that you can make. But again, the question is that's a lot harder than just theorizing about the connections between Traore and Sankara. You can go viral talking about these individual charismatic figures, but the depth of knowledge of institutional formation and the flows of money and things like patent law is very complicated and difficult. But if you actually want to improve conditions, not just at home, but understanding things you can materially do to improve conditions overseas, that would be a good example. And I think the last thing I would say is, we've talked about it a lot. One of the biggest things that is powering this push towards Pan-African connection in this region is public safety. Now, over there, it's public safety largely from Islamic extremists. But I think that Traore delivering on public safety is why he's become so beloved in Burkina Faso. Like reading about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they're struggling as, they kicked out the French, brought in the Russians, had more interstate cooperation, and Traore's a military guy. Like his ability to deliver on public safety allowed him to get the political support necessary to do the economic reforms. And I think that's a very similar thing that we say here, is that leftists need to deliver on public safety, how we define it, around community violence, around the assaults and the robberies that happen that never get reported to the police. So even talking about the numbers are declining, that can be true. At the same time, people's fears are not just imagined. There are all these things happening that aren't shootings and murders, which are down, in part because people have invested in grassroots organizations to actually deal with that. But there's still legit needs around public safety that we have to continue to deliver on. And the folks who deliver on those things will get the political capital necessary to be able to do potentially more economic reforms. And if you leave that space open to the centrists and the liberals and the conservatives, then they're going to use that as a wedge issue to block the leftists from more radical forms of economic redistribution. But if we claim those things and deliver on those things, then the left will be able to get that political capital, and they should be able to do that better, given their focus on economic redistribution, given their focus on getting resources from the rich and building out community-based institutions. But actually delivering on that on the ground will create the context for more radical avenues of economic redistribution. And that's one of the biggest things I got from seeing the Sahel, which was a really basic thing where Al-Qaeda and ISIS were a lot stronger before AES and are weaker now. So if that's what AES is, then people like it, And sometimes we have these big theoretical debates, but sometimes it can be just that simple in terms of demonstrating to the people a real focus on delivering on core concerns and then building from there, right? So it's hard to enjoy the tomato juice canning factory when the stability within the capital is being disrupted by bombings, or your friends and family in the border regions are more at risk, right?
Sons and daughters who's memorized Sankara's last speech. For every mine you steal, we've mapped 1,000 more with GPS you can't hack. So choose. Stay and be their minority, or stand with us and be the majority of the future. But hurry, the drones are circling, the banks are trembling, and the sun of the Sahel rises hot. We are the reckoning. Are you ready to be counted? They think this is about borders, about presidents, about gold. Let me show you the real war. When a Haitian child starves, soil trembles in Niger. When a Chicago cop murders, our youth march in Bamako at dawn. When Brazil burns its favelas, the ashes land in Ouagadougou. We are not countries, we are one body, and America France. There's surgeons with dirty knives trying to cut us into pieces they can sell. To my brothers in the Bronx projects, you're rats and roaches? We have them too. Sent in cargo ships from Europe in 1960. Same pests, same poison to my sisters in Johannesburg townships when your taps run dry. It's the same French water company stealing rain in Burkina. Same thieves, same chains. To the children in Gaza, we see you. When they bomb your schools, they test the weapons first on our villages. Oh, they think we don't talk, but the Fulani herder's satellite phone connects directly to a Rasta in Kingston. The Wolof fishmonger's daughter codes apps with a Haitian in Montreal. The Santero in Havana lights candles that flicker in sync with our shrine fires in Benin. We've always been whispering, now we're screaming. Your drones? We jam them with tech from Detroit Garage. Your sanctions? We trade in whispers and gold teeth. Your propaganda? Our children laugh at your cuts. To my people worldwide when the final collapse comes. And it's coming. Meet me in the Sahara. Bring seeds. Bring books. Bring the bones of your ancestors. We'll rebuild from the dust they left us. And this time, we keep the receipts. They never taught you we could hack satellites. Did they? A distorted transmission cutting through emergency broadcast frequencies. You hear static? Good, that means we're winning. They shut down our internet, so we speak through old ham radios tuned to 146.32 MHz. They bomb our towers, so we broadcast from abandoned vaccination drones. They call us terrorists while their drones write death warrants in our farmland. Let me show you the truth they pixelate. 1. The French aid workers in the geologists tagging uranium deposits with RFID chips. Their malaria nets contain fiber optic surveillance threads too. The blackouts in Atlanta, Detroit. The stress tests for the coming economic siege. They're practicing how to freeze your accounts like they froze Mali's Gold 3. The migration crisis. A weapons test for biometric tracking they'll use on you. The same facial recognition that hunts us in Dakar will scan you in Dallas. To the tech workers in Silicon Valley. Your code helps tag drone targets in my field. But the backdoor you built, we found it. To the soldiers in Fort Bragg, they train you on Senegalese terrain maps. Your drill sergeants don't know we swapped the coordinates. To the journalists embedded in Sahel, your sat phones ping through our hacked Starlink nodes. We read your drafts before your editors do.
Hey, Lawrence again. So for the outro, I had to put that in there because I think that's one of the things that drew me to do this topic as well. That is claiming to be a speech from Ibrahim Traoré. That is not a speech from Ibrahim Traoré. That is AI. But in that AI piece, I think you see one of the things that make this topic so appealing and so dangerous. So you hear this flowing speech of, when we take over, bring the bones of your ancestors, bury them in African soil, come back to the continent, this romantic notion of Pan-African liberation, mixed with this abstract cultural politics. One of the things that they say is like, we use the drums and ham radio when they jam our signals. and here's the frequency we're using. It's like, well, if this were Ibrahim Traoré, the last thing he would do is actually give you the actual frequency they were using. And I think it's one of those things where it's so demonstrative of one of the things I wanted to make sure we hammered home as this episode ends, which is we can't allow the romantic vision of AES and Traore to obscure the reality of needing to know empirically what's happening on the ground. One of the things he says in other parts of this AI speech is, oh, if you jam our internet, we'll just use the drums to communicate. And it's like, in real life, they won't. They need internet. So we need to know if they're dependent on Starlink, then that's something we need to know, and we need to deal with Elon Musk or figure out some other way for them to talk to each other. But if we have this romantic vision of, oh, the technologies of our ancestors will liberate us beyond the limitations of technological capitalism, and we'll use these ancient tools to defeat our oppressor, that sort of romanticism is not something that we can afford in the real material reality that AES and Burkino Faso and folks' real life material lives are actually at stake, for lack of a better word. And I think it's important for us to hear how it slips so seamlessly into what I could say is legitimate conspiracy theory. Like, you can see the attacks on Traore as not confirmed, but very likely in terms of there's an untold number of potential assassination attempts that they claim on Ibrahim Traore's life, and that leads to people, you can see it on YouTube, sleeping in front of the Capitol to defend Ibrahim Traore in the midst of a Western-backed coup. But the reality of the real levels of global capitalist violence done to places that buck the West, linking it to 5G conspiracies and linking it to conspiracies around, oh, they brought the rats in 1960 and the roaches in 1960. Like, I don't think that's true. I don't think Africa needed the West to send rats and roaches. But it allows us to, again, the way I framed it is that in this piece, Ibrahim Traore is an African version of Q from the mythology of QAnon, giving you breadcrumbs to see how they're actually defeating the Western deep state, the international Western deep state. And we can just, one of the famous Q quotes is, get the popcorn ready, sit back and enjoy. And that's what lulls us into sometimes sleep as Pan-Africanists, is this belief that we can see the truth, we can see through it, and we can root for Ibrahim Traore and AES the way we root for Liverpool, or the way we root for the Dallas Cowboys or the Ravens or the Orioles. And I think this piece was so demonstrative. I think the beauty and the pull, but also the dangers embedded in a Pan-African solidarity that I had to include it. Plus, we were a little short, so we had time. So again, we appreciate you going on this ride with us. We thank you. Please check out our website, lbsbaltimore.com. If you have any comments, you can check out how to contact us. Our emails are all available on the About Us page. You can see more about the way we use Pan-African concepts and theory in our works through our written reports. We have one that links African notions of public health to a critique of the public health approach of violence prevention in Fear of a Black Planet, which is a report we did last year. Obviously, you can check out our back catalog of podcasts, and of course, you can find our back catalog of podcasts on the Black Liberation Media YouTube page and website. So please check out Black Liberation Media. Please check out lbsbaltimore.com. If you're able, please consider joining our sustainer program. We ask folks to give, starting at $10 a month, money to allow us to continue as an independent, Black-led think tank. We are not a nonprofit. We made a very intentional decision to not be a nonprofit so that no one can censor us as we talk about folks who are openly antagonistic to the West and openly antagonistic to capitalism in the way we do in this podcast. And that's because the freedom provided to us by our sustainers and our supporters. So again, if you're able, please consider going to lbsbaltimore/sustain and doing whatever you can to support our work. And with that, as always, we thank you, and I will see you next time.